Judge Jasmine Coleman stepped through the marble lobby of the federal courthouse, her Hermes briefcase containing 18 arrest warrants that would reshape a major drug trafficking investigation. She had no idea that in the next 5 minutes, one racist cop's assumptions would turn her morning commute into a viral moment of justice. Before we dive into this shocking story of racial profiling in America's halls of justice, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe respect should be universal, regardless of skin color or assumptions about someone's position. Now, buckle up as we explore how one powerful woman turned humiliation into accountability that would echo through the entire criminal justice system. At exactly 8:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in downtown Detroit, Jasmine Coleman approached the brass-plated elevator bank in the federal building. Her burgundy suit was immaculately tailored, her natural hair styled in an elegant updo, and her confident stride spoke of someone comfortable navigating the corridors of power. At 38, she was the youngest federal magistrate judge in the Eastern District of Michigan, a position she had earned through 15 years of exceptional legal work and unwavering dedication to justice. The elevator doors stood open, and Officer Bradley Stevens, a 20-year veteran of the courthouse security detail, stood directly in front of them. His massive frame blocked the entrance as he spoke into his radio, deliberately ignoring Jasmine's approach. She waited politely for a moment, assuming he would step aside once he finished his conversation. "Excuse me," Jasmine said pleasantly when Stevens made no move to allow her passage. "I need to get to the 8th floor." Stevens looked up from his radio, his cold blue eyes scanning her from head to toe with undisguised disdain. "Courthouse employees use the service elevator," he stated flatly. "This one's for judicial staff and attorneys only." Jasmine's eyebrows rose slightly. Despite her professional attire and obvious confidence, Stevens had automatically categorized her as support staff. "I understand the protocol," she replied evenly. "I'm Judge Coleman." Stevens's expression shifted from indifference to outright skepticism. "Sure you are," he said with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "And I'm the Chief Justice. Listen, sweetheart, I don't know what game you're playing, but the service elevator is around the corner. Use it." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. Jasmine felt the familiar weight settle in her chest, the burden of being viewed as something she wasn't simply because of her race and gender. She'd experienced it in law school when classmates assumed she was there on affirmative action. She'd felt it in her first law firm when partners questioned whether she could handle complex cases. She'd confronted it during her confirmation hearings when senators grilled her more intensely than her white male predecessors. "Officer Stevens," Jasmine said, reading his nameplate, "I'm Federal Magistrate Judge Jasmine Coleman. I need to access my chambers on the 8th floor to review time-sensitive warrant applications." Stevens crossed his arms over his chest, his stance becoming more aggressive. "Right. And I'm supposed to just take your word for it? You don't look like any judge I've ever seen." The implication hung in the air like toxic smoke. A small crowd had begun to gather in the lobby, court clerks heading to work, attorneys arriving for morning hearings, and other courthouse employees slowed their pace to observe the confrontation. Several people had their phones out, recognizing the potential significance of what was unfolding. "What exactly does a judge look like to you?" Jasmine asked, her voice remaining calm despite the anger building inside her. Stevens shrugged. "Professional, respectable, someone with the right qualifications and background." Each word was carefully chosen to wound without explicitly stating his racial bias. Jasmine reached into her briefcase and withdrew her judicial identification card, holding it out for Stevens to examine. He barely glanced at it before waving it away dismissively. "Anyone can get a fake ID made these days," he declared loudly enough for the growing crowd to hear. "I'm not falling for whatever scam you're running here, lady. Now move along before I have to escort you out of the building." The threat was clear and humiliating. Here stood a federal magistrate judge, a woman who had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law School, who had clerked for a Supreme Court justice, who had prosecuted high-profile federal cases for over a decade before being appointed to the bench by the President of the United States, and she was being threatened with removal from her own workplace. Calvin, a black security guard who had worked at the courthouse for 8 years, approached hesitantly. He recognized Judge Coleman from her daily routine and had always been impressed by her kindness to the support staff. Unlike many judges who barely acknowledged the existence of security personnel, she always greeted him by name and asked about his family. "Officer Stevens," Calvin began diplomatically, "I think there might be some confusion here. This is actually—" "Mind your own business, Calvin," Stevens snapped without taking his eyes off Jasmine. "I know how to do my job. This woman is not authorized to use this elevator, and I'm not going to be fooled by some elaborate con game." Calvin stepped back, his face a mask of frustrated helplessness. He knew challenging Stevens directly would likely cost him his job, but watching this injustice unfold was painful. Jasmine pulled out her phone and speed-dialed the chambers of Chief Judge Hughes, the senior federal judge in the district. As the phone rang, Stevens watched her with growing irritation. "Chief Judge Hughes's chambers," answered the familiar voice of Denise, the Chief Judge's longtime secretary. "Denise, it's Judge Coleman. I'm in the lobby and there seems to be some confusion about my identity. Could you please send Isaiah down to escort me to chambers?" Stevens's confidence wavered slightly as he heard the professional nature of the conversation. Isaiah Washington was the chief bailiff, a respected figure in the courthouse who had worked there for over 15 years. "Of course, Judge Coleman," Denise replied with concern. "He'll be right down. Is everything okay?" "I'm sure it will be resolved shortly," Jasmine replied diplomatically, ending the call. Stevens's face had begun to flush red. "Making fake phone calls now? How desperate are you to get into this building? What are you really after?" The accusation that she was some kind of infiltrator or threat was the final straw. Jasmine's composure, maintained through years of dealing with subtle and overt racism, began to crack. "I am Federal Magistrate Judge Jasmine Coleman," she said, her voice rising slightly but still controlled. "I was appointed to this position by President Biden and confirmed by the United States Senate. I have presided over thousands of cases, signed countless warrants, and sent numerous criminals to federal prison. Your refusal to acknowledge my authority based on your preconceived notions about what a judge should look like is not only professionally inappropriate, but potentially constitutes a civil rights violation." The crowd had grown larger and several people were now openly recording the confrontation. Stevens noticed the cameras and his demeanor became even more hostile. "Are you threatening me?" he demanded. "Because that sounds like a threat. Maybe I should call for backup and have you arrested for disorderly conduct and threatening a federal officer." The absurdity of the situation had reached its peak. A federal magistrate judge was being threatened with arrest by a security officer who refused to believe her identity because she didn't fit his narrow conception of what judicial authority looked like. The elevator chimed softly as the doors opened to reveal Isaiah, a tall, dignified black man in his 50s, wearing the distinctive uniform of a federal bailiff. His eyes immediately took in the scene. Judge Coleman standing calmly with her identification still in hand, Officer Stevens blocking the elevator with his arms crossed, and a crowd of onlookers capturing everything on their phones. "Good morning, Judge Coleman," Isaiah said clearly, stepping out of the elevator. "I apologize for any inconvenience. Would you like me to escort you to chambers?" The simple acknowledgement hit Stevens like a physical blow. His face went pale as the reality of his massive mistake began to sink in. The woman he had been harassing, threatening, and humiliating was exactly who she claimed to be. There must have been some misunderstanding," Stevens stammered, suddenly finding his voice much smaller than it had been moments before. "Indeed there was," Jasmine replied coolly, stepping past him into the elevator. "A misunderstanding about who belongs in these halls of justice and who doesn't." As the elevator doors began to close, Stevens made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Judge Coleman, I was just following security protocols. I didn't mean any disrespect. Jasmine looked him directly in the eyes as the doors closed. "Officer Stevens, what you meant and what you did are two very different things, and what you did was captured on multiple cameras by dozens of witnesses. I suggest you speak with your supervisor about proper identification verification procedures." The elevator rose silently toward the 8th floor, carrying with it a federal magistrate judge whose morning had been derailed by racism and a bailiff who had witnessed yet another example of how prejudice could blind people to truth and authority. In the lobby below, Stevens stood alone as the crowd dispersed, many already uploading their videos to social media with captions like, "Racist cop blocks federal judge from her own courthouse," and "This is what discrimination looks like in 2024. Within hours, these videos would have millions of views, and Stevens would find himself at the center of a national conversation about racial bias in law enforcement. But first, Jasmine had warrants to sign and justice to serve, even as she processed the humiliation and anger from an encounter that perfectly illustrated why her presence on the federal bench was so necessary and so threatening to those who preferred the old ways of doing things. To understand the magnitude of Officer Stevens' mistake, one must first understand the remarkable journey of Jasmine Coleman from the housing projects of Chicago's South Side to the federal bench in Detroit. Her story was not one of privilege or easy paths, but of relentless determination and exceptional brilliance that had been tested by racism and sexism at every turn. Jasmine Renee Coleman was born in 1985 in the Robert Taylor Homes, a public housing project that had become synonymous with urban decay and hopelessness. Her mother, Gloria Coleman, worked 3 jobs: cleaning offices downtown during the day, stocking shelves at a grocery store in the evening, and caring for elderly residents in a nursing home on weekends. Despite her exhaustion, Gloria never missed a parent-teacher conference or a school play. "Education is your way out," Gloria would tell Jasmine every morning as she braided her daughter's hair before school. "They can take everything else from you, but they can't take what's in your mind." The local public school Jasmine attended was severely underfunded. Textbooks were decades old, many with pages missing or torn. The science lab consisted of a few broken microscopes and outdated periodic charts. Windows were cracked, heating was sporadic during brutal Chicago winters, and violence was a constant threat both inside and outside the school walls. Yet Jasmine thrived academically. By 4th grade, she was reading at a high school level. Her teacher, Mrs. Dorothy Jefferson, recognized her potential and began staying after school to provide additional instruction. "This child has something special," Mrs. Jefferson told Gloria during a conference. "She understands complex concepts intuitively. She asks questions that make me think." When Jasmine was 12, a shooting occurred just outside her school. A stray bullet shattered a classroom window where she had been sitting just moments before. That night, as sirens wailed in the distance and her mother held her tight, Jasmine made a decision that would define her life. "Mama, I want to be a lawyer," she announced. "I want to put the bad people in jail so kids don't have to be scared at school." Gloria smiled through her tears. "Then that's what you'll be, baby girl. Whatever it takes." What it took was extraordinary sacrifice from both mother and daughter. Gloria worked additional shifts to pay for SAT prep courses and college application fees. Jasmine studied by streetlight when the electricity was shut off, completed homework in hospital waiting rooms while her mother worked, and walked miles to the library because they couldn't afford bus fare. Her academic excellence earned her a full scholarship to Northwestern University, but arriving on the Evanston campus in 2003 brought new challenges. She was often the only black student in her classes, and her professors frequently called on her to provide the black perspective on issues ranging from criminal justice to welfare policy. During her junior year, a classmate named Brad Morrison approached her after a constitutional law class. "You know, you're really articulate for someone from your background," he said, apparently intending it as a compliment. "I bet you'll get into Harvard Law School easily with affirmative action." The assumption that her achievements were somehow less valid because of her race was infuriating. But Jasmine had learned to channel her anger into motivation. She graduated summa cum laude with a double major in political science and African American studies, earning the highest GPA in the political science department. Harvard Law School accepted her with a full merit scholarship, not affirmative action as Brad had predicted, but based purely on her academic achievements and LSAT score in the 99th percentile. Yet even at Harvard, the microaggressions continued. Professor Richard Blackstone, a criminal law instructor, regularly called on Jasmine to discuss cases involving black defendants. "Miss Coleman," he would say, "given your background, what insights can you offer about the defendant's motivations?" The implication was always the same, that her race, rather than her analytical skills, was her primary qualification for participation. During her second year, Jasmine was invited to interview for the Harvard Law Review, the most prestigious position available to law students. The interview went excellently until one of the editors, a third-year student named Christopher Hayes, asked her a question that had nothing to do with legal analysis. "Do you think you can relate to our readership?" Hayes asked. "Our audience is primarily judges, attorneys at top firms, and legal academics. They might have different perspectives than what you're used to." Jasmine looked him directly in the eyes. "If you're asking whether I can write legal analysis that meets the standards of the Harvard Law Review, the answer is yes. If you're asking whether my race disqualifies me from understanding complex legal issues, the answer is that the question itself reveals more about your limitations than mine." She was selected for the Law Review and eventually became its first black female president, a position that brought both recognition and additional scrutiny. Every article she wrote was examined more closely than those of her white counterparts. Every decision she made was questioned and second-guessed. Upon graduation, Jasmine was recruited by several prestigious law firms, ultimately choosing Preston, Whitmore, and Associates in Detroit because of their commitment to public interest work. She started as a junior associate in their white-collar criminal defense division, but her true passion lay in prosecution. After 3 years at Preston Whitmore, Jasmine made a decision that surprised many of her colleagues. She left the lucrative private sector to become an assistant United States attorney in the Eastern District of Michigan. The pay cut was significant, but the opportunity to fight for justice rather than just for wealthy clients was irresistible. As a federal prosecutor, Jasmine quickly made her mark. She specialized in public corruption cases, taking on politicians, police officers, and business leaders who abused their power. Her first major case involved a Detroit city councilman who had been taking bribes from construction companies in exchange for favorable zoning decisions. The defense attorney, a prominent white lawyer named Robert Steinberg, attempted to undermine her credibility during opening statements. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, "the prosecution would have you believe that my client, a respected public servant with 30 years of experience, is guilty based on the accusations of prosecutors who may not fully understand the complexities of municipal governance." The coded language was clear to everyone in the courtroom. Jasmine was too young, too black, too female to understand how things really worked in city government. But when she presented her closing argument, methodically destroying the defense's case with evidence and legal precedent, the jury deliberated for only 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Over the next 8 years, Jasmine built a reputation as one of the most effective federal prosecutors in the district. She successfully prosecuted complex racketeering cases, major drug trafficking organizations, and high-profile corruption scandals. Her conviction rate was over 90%, and her legal briefs were frequently cited by appellate courts. In 2019, when Federal Magistrate Judge Thomas Richardson announced his retirement, several attorneys were mentioned as potential replacements. Jasmine's name was frequently discussed, but many political observers doubted she would be selected. At 34, she would be remarkably young for such a position, and she would be only the second black female federal judge in Michigan's history. The selection process was rigorous. A judicial nominating commission reviewed dozens of applications, conducted extensive interviews, and performed thorough background checks. Jasmine's interview lasted 3 hours and covered everything from her judicial philosophy to her approach to sentencing disparities. Commission member Judge Eleanor Hartwell, a conservative appellate court judge, posed a challenging question. Ms. Coleman, some critics argue that prosecutors from your background might bring inappropriate biases to the bench. How would you respond to concerns that your personal experiences might cloud your judicial objectivity? Jasmine's response would later be quoted in legal journals. Your Honor, every judge brings their life experiences to the bench. The question is not whether those experiences exist, but whether they enhance or compromise our ability to administer justice fairly. My experiences growing up in poverty, witnessing the effects of crime on communities, and working within the criminal justice system have given me insights that I believe make me a better jurist, not a biased one. Justice is not colorblind. It should be informed by the full spectrum of American experience. When President Biden nominated her for the position in early 2021, the announcement generated significant attention. Conservative legal blogs questioned her qualifications, progressive organizations praised her groundbreaking appointment, and legal scholars debated her potential impact on federal jurisprudence. During her Senate confirmation hearings, Jasmine faced intense questioning from Republican senators who seemed determined to find flaws in her record. Senator Jake Morrison from Alabama spent 20 minutes grilling her about a single prosecutorial decision from 2016, repeatedly suggesting she had been overzealous in pursuing charges against a white police officer who had used excessive force. Judge Coleman, Senator Morrison said with barely concealed hostility, don't you think your background might make you predisposed to rule against law enforcement officers? Jasmine's response was measured but firm. Senator, my record shows that I have prosecuted criminals regardless of their race, profession, or social status. Justice requires equal treatment under law, and that principle will guide every decision I make from the bench. The confirmation vote was closer than many had expected, passing 52-48 along largely partisan lines. But on a sunny day in September 2021, Jasmine Coleman took the oath of office to become the youngest federal magistrate judge in the Eastern District of Michigan. Her investiture ceremony was held in the same courthouse where, just over 2 years later, she would be denied access to an elevator by a security officer who couldn't believe that someone who looked like her could hold such a position of authority. Chief Judge Hughes, who had become a mentor and supporter, spoke at the ceremony. Judge Coleman represents the best of American justice. Her brilliance, integrity, and commitment to fairness will serve this court and this nation with distinction. As Jasmine took her judicial oath that day, with her mother Gloria beaming in the front row, she could never have imagined that her mere presence in the courthouse would be seen as illegitimate by some of the very people tasked with protecting it. But then again, she had spent her entire life proving herself to people who assumed she didn't belong. The difference now was that she had the power and authority to ensure that such assumptions had consequences. Within 30 minutes of Officer Stevens's confrontation with Judge Coleman, the courthouse buzzed with activity that had nothing to do with scheduled hearings or legal proceedings. Word of the incident spread through the building faster than wildfire, carried by whispered conversations, urgent text messages, and social media posts from the witnesses who had captured the entire scene on their phones. Judge Coleman sat in her chambers on the 8th floor, attempting to refocus on the urgent warrant applications spread across her mahogany desk. 18 arrest warrants related to a major drug trafficking investigation required her immediate attention, but her mind kept returning to the humiliating encounter in the lobby. She had faced discrimination throughout her career, but never so blatantly and publicly in her own workplace. A soft knock on her door interrupted her troubled thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting to see her law clerk Claire with case files or scheduling updates. Instead, Chief Judge Hughes entered, his usually composed expression tight with concern and barely contained anger. At 62, Hughes was a respected jurist who had served on the federal bench for over 15 years. He had been instrumental in Jasmine's appointment and had become both a mentor and advocate for her work. "Jasmine," he said, settling into one of the leather chairs across from her desk, "I heard what happened downstairs. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Jasmine replied automatically, then paused. "Actually, no, I'm not fine. I'm angry and I'm tired of having to prove my legitimacy in my own courthouse." Hughes nodded grimly. "I've already spoken with Captain Murphy from Courthouse Security. She's reviewing the incident and will be taking appropriate action. The video footage is being preserved as evidence." "Evidence of what, exactly?" Jasmine asked. "We both know that Officer Stevens will claim he was just following security protocols. He'll say he didn't recognize me and was being cautious. The department will probably put him through sensitivity training and consider the matter closed." "Not this time," Hughes said firmly. "This incident was witnessed by dozens of people and recorded from multiple angles. The videos are already going viral on social media. The optics are terrible for the courthouse, but more importantly, what happened to you was completely unacceptable." As if summoned by their conversation, Hughes's phone buzzed with an incoming call from District Attorney James Whitfield. Hughes put the call on speaker with Jasmine's permission. "Judge Hughes," Whitfield's voice filled the chamber. "I've been fielding calls from reporters all morning about an incident involving Judge Coleman. What exactly happened?" Hughes provided a brief summary while Jasmine listened, still processing the surreal nature of discussing her own humiliation as a matter of public interest. When he finished, Whitfield was silent for a long moment. "This is a disaster," Whitfield finally said. "Judge Coleman, I want you to know that you have my complete support. This kind of behavior is absolutely intolerable." "I appreciate that," Jasmine replied, though she wondered how genuine his support would be once the media attention died down. After ending the call, Hughes turned to Jasmine with an expression she'd rarely seen from him, determination mixed with protective anger. "Jasmine, I want you to consider filing a formal complaint with the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts. What Stevens did goes beyond a simple mistake. His behavior was discriminatory and created a hostile work environment." Before Jasmine could respond, her chamber's door opened again. This time it was Claire, her 26-year-old law clerk, carrying a tablet with obvious urgency. "Judge Coleman, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you need to see this," Claire said, her voice trembling slightly. "The videos from this morning are everywhere." She placed the tablet on Jasmine's desk, showing a Twitter feed where multiple videos of the confrontation played simultaneously. The hashtags "Bar Racist Cop" and "Bar Federal Judge" were already trending, and the view counts were climbing rapidly. One video, shot by a court clerk named Marcus Thompson, captured the entire encounter with crystal clarity. The audio was perfect, picking up every word of Stevens's dismissive comments and Jasmine's dignified responses. The visual was even more powerful, a well-dressed, professional black woman being blocked and humiliated by a white security officer who refused to acknowledge her authority. "Over 2 million views already," Claire reported, scrolling through the comments. "And the mainstream media is picking it up. CNN, NBC, The Washington Post, they're all running the story." Hughes watched one of the videos with growing dismay. "The audio makes it even worse than I thought. Stevens's comment about you not looking like any judge he's ever seen is clearly discriminatory." As they watched, Jasmine's phone began ringing incessantly. Her assistant fielded calls from reporters, civil rights organizations, legal advocacy groups, and even congressional offices. The local NAACP chapter had already issued a statement calling for Stevens's immediate termination and a full investigation into discriminatory practices at the federal courthouse. "I need some air," Jasmine said, standing and moving to the window that overlooked downtown Detroit. The irony wasn't lost on her. From her chambers, she could see the street where she had grown up in poverty, dreaming of someday having the power to create positive change. Now she had that power, but she was being reminded in the most humiliating way possible that some people would never see her as legitimate. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her mother. "Baby, I saw the news. Are you okay? I'm proud of how you handled yourself. Keep your head up. Love you." The message brought tears to Jasmine's eyes. Her mother, who had sacrificed everything to give her daughter opportunities she never had, shouldn't have to watch her child being humiliated on national television. Another knock on the door revealed Captain Rebecca Murphy from Courthouse Security, a stern-looking woman in her 50s who had overseen security operations for the past 8 years. Murphy's face was grim as she entered the chambers. "Judge Coleman, Chief Judge Hughes," Murphy began formally, "I want to offer my sincerest apologies for Officer Stevens's conduct. His behavior was completely inappropriate and violated every principle of professional courtesy and basic human decency." "What consequences will he face?" Hughes asked directly. "He's been suspended immediately pending a full investigation," Murphy replied. "However, I want you to know that this investigation will be thorough and transparent. We're also reviewing all security protocols to ensure this type of incident never happens again." Jasmine turned from the window to face Murphy. "Captain, with respect, how many other judges in this building have been asked to prove their identity to use the elevator?" Murphy's uncomfortable silence provided the answer. "Exactly," Jasmine continued. "This wasn't about security protocols. This was about a man who couldn't accept that someone who looks like me could hold the position that I hold." As the day progressed, the story continued to gain momentum. Legal scholars were interviewed on cable news programs discussing the broader implications of racial bias in the judicial system. Civil rights leaders called for systematic reforms in courthouse security practices. Social media users shared their own experiences of discrimination in professional settings. By evening, the story had reached the highest levels of the federal judiciary. Judge Patricia Collins, Chief Judge of the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, called Hughes directly. "George," Judge Collins said, using Hughes's first name in a conversation that Jasmine was again invited to hear, "this incident is unacceptable. The entire federal judiciary is watching how we respond. Judge Coleman's treatment reflects on all of us." The weight of institutional attention was both validating and overwhelming. Jasmine had become the unwilling face of a national conversation about racism and respect for judicial authority. That evening, as Jasmine finally left her chambers after a day that had begun with warrant applications and devolved into crisis management, she noticed something different in how courthouse staff interacted with her. Security guards who had previously offered perfunctory nods now made deliberate eye contact and spoke respectfully. Court clerks who had been polite but distant were now warm and supportive. The incident had forced everyone to confront their own assumptions and behaviors. Isaiah, the bailiff who had rescued her from the morning's confrontation, approached as she waited for the elevator. "Judge Coleman," he said quietly, "I want you to know that a lot of us have been dealing with Stevens's attitude for years. He's made inappropriate comments to several black employees. What happened to you this morning? It needed to happen to someone with the power to do something about it. No one should have to endure discrimination," Jasmine replied. "But I understand what you're saying. If this incident leads to changes that protect other people, then at least something positive will come from it." As the elevator doors opened, the same elevator she had been denied access to 12 hours earlier, Jasmine reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. She had become a federal judge to serve justice, not to be a symbol of racial progress. But sometimes history chooses its moments and its actors in unexpected ways. The elevator carried her down to the lobby, where a few reporters still lingered hoping for a statement. Jasmine walked past them with dignified silence, but she could feel their cameras following her every step. Outside in the cool Detroit evening, as her driver held open the car door, Jasmine allowed herself one look back at the federal building. Tomorrow she would return to sign warrants, hear cases, and serve justice. But the courthouse would never be quite the same place it had been before Officer Stevens decided that she didn't look like she belonged. The question now was what would happen next and whether the attention and outrage would translate into meaningful change or simply fade into the background noise of America's ongoing struggle with race and power. The next morning brought no respite from the media storm. Jasmine arrived at the courthouse to find news vans lined up along the street and reporters staking out every entrance. The normally quiet federal building had become the center of a national conversation about racial bias in law enforcement and the judicial system. Security had been increased overnight, with additional officers posted at all entrances and metal detectors operating at peak efficiency. The irony was not lost on anyone. A building that supposedly hadn't been secure enough to allow a black federal judge access to an elevator now resembled a fortress protecting her from an entirely different kind of threat. Captain Murphy met Jasmine at a side entrance, personally escorting her through the building. "Judge Coleman, we've implemented additional security measures to protect your privacy and ensure your safety," Murphy explained as they walked. "Some of the online reaction has been concerning." Indeed, while most of the social media response had been supportive of Jasmine, there was also a disturbing undercurrent of racist commentary questioning her qualifications and suggesting that the incident had been overblown. Several anonymous accounts had posted personal information about her family and background, leading to legitimate security concerns. In her chambers, Jasmine found a stack of letters and emails that her staff had printed out. Messages of support from fellow judges, attorneys, law students, and ordinary citizens who had been moved by her dignified response to discrimination. But there were also hate-filled messages that reminded her why her presence on the federal bench was both necessary and threatening to some. One letter stood out among the rest, written in careful handwriting on expensive stationery. "Dear Judge Coleman, I am a retired federal judge who served for 32 years. I want you to know that what happened to you yesterday was a disgrace to our entire profession. When I started on the bench in 1985, there were very few judges who looked like you. The fact that such ignorance persists in 2024 is a reminder of how much work we still have to do. Please don't let this incident discourage you from the vital work you do. Sincerely, Judge Eleanor Watson, Ret." The supportive messages provided some comfort, but Jasmine's focus remained on the investigation into Stevens's conduct. She had decided to cooperate fully with the internal investigation while also considering her legal options. Around mid-morning, Hughes appeared in her doorway again, this time accompanied by FBI Special Agent Lisa Henderson, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who specialized in civil rights violations. "Judge Coleman," Hughes said, "Agent Henderson is here to discuss the federal investigation into yesterday's incident." Jasmine looked up with surprise. "Federal investigation?" Agent Henderson stepped forward. "Judge Coleman, the FBI takes allegations of civil rights violations against federal officials very seriously. Officer Stevens's conduct potentially violates federal civil rights statutes, specifically Section 242, which criminalizes the willful deprivation of constitutional rights under color of law. The implications were significant. What had begun as an internal personnel matter was now potentially a federal crime. The Department of Justice has asked us to conduct a thorough investigation," Henderson continued. "This includes reviewing all video evidence, interviewing witnesses, and examining Officer Stevens's employment record for patterns of discriminatory behavior." As if summoned by the mention of patterns, Henderson opened a thick folder on Jasmine's desk. "Judge Coleman, what we've discovered in the past 24 hours is troubling. We've identified at least 6 other incidents over the past 3 years where Officer Stevens made inappropriate comments or took questionable actions toward black employees or visitors to the courthouse." The folder contained formal complaints, witness statements, and internal memos that painted a picture of systemic problems that went far beyond one morning's confrontation. A black court reporter had complained that Stevens frequently questioned her presence in restricted areas despite her clearly displayed credentials. Two black attorneys had reported being subjected to additional security screenings that their white colleagues had not faced. A visiting professor from the University of Michigan Law School had been asked to provide 3 forms of identification before being allowed to observe court proceedings. Why weren't these complaints acted upon? Jasmine asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. According to the internal records, most were dismissed as misunderstandings or miscommunications, Henderson replied. Stevens received informal counseling after some incidents but no formal discipline. His supervisors consistently rated his performance as satisfactory. Hughes's face grew darker as he reviewed the documents. This is exactly the kind of institutional blindness that allowed yesterday's incident to occur. Multiple warning signs were ignored because no one wanted to confront the uncomfortable truth about Stevens's behavior. The conversation was interrupted by a knock from Claire, who entered with obvious urgency. Judge Coleman, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's been a development. Officer Stevens just gave an interview to Channel 7 News. They quickly gathered around Claire's laptop to watch the interview, which had aired just minutes before. Stevens sat across from reporter David Fletcher, looking defensive but attempting to project an image of wounded professionalism. I want to be clear, Stevens said to the camera. I am not a racist. I was simply doing my job, following security protocols to protect the courthouse. I didn't recognize Judge Coleman, and in today's security environment, we can't take any chances. Fletcher pressed him on the specifics. But Officer Stevens, Judge Coleman presented her judicial identification card. Why didn't that resolve the situation? Stevens shifted uncomfortably. Identification can be forged. We see it all the time. I was being cautious, and I would have done the same thing regardless of the person's race. But witnesses say you told Judge Coleman she didn't look like any judge you'd ever seen. What did you mean by that? I meant she looked young, Stevens replied quickly. Most judges are older, more experienced looking. It had nothing to do with race. The interview continued, with Stevens maintaining his innocence while simultaneously digging himself deeper with each answer. When Fletcher asked about the other complaints against him, Stevens became visibly agitated. Those are all misunderstandings being blown out of proportion because of what happened yesterday. People are trying to make me a scapegoat for problems I didn't create. As the interview concluded, Agent Henderson shook her head grimly. He just made our case stronger. The denial, the continued disrespect, the refusal to acknowledge any wrongdoing, it all supports the pattern of discriminatory behavior. Hughes was equally disturbed. That interview was against legal advice. His attorney must be furious, but it shows his true character. Even now, faced with overwhelming evidence, he can't admit fault. The afternoon brought another unexpected visitor to Jasmine's chambers. Tyrone Williams, president of the National Bar Association, had flown in from Washington specifically to meet with her. Williams was a distinguished attorney in his 50s who had built a reputation as a powerful advocate for diversity in the legal profession. Judge Coleman, Williams said as he settled into her office, I want you to know that you have the full support of the National Bar Association. What happened to you yesterday was an attack on all black legal professionals. I appreciate that, Jasmine replied, but I don't want to be seen as playing the victim. I handled the situation, and now the system needs to handle Officer Stevens. Williams nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right approach. But you should know that this incident has sparked a broader conversation about the treatment of black judges and attorneys in federal courthouses across the country. We're hearing similar stories from jurisdictions nationwide. He opened his briefcase and withdrew a tablet showing social media posts and news articles from around the country. Federal Judge Robert Franklin in Atlanta had shared his own story of being questioned by security despite 20 years on the bench. Judge Monica Jefferson in Los Angeles had been mistaken for a court reporter multiple times. Attorney after attorney had come forward with stories of being treated as if they didn't belong in courtrooms where they practiced daily. Your dignity in handling this situation has given others the courage to speak out, Williams continued. We're calling for a nationwide review of courthouse security practices and judicial protection protocols. The conversation was interrupted by another urgent knock. This time it was Hughes himself, looking more serious than Jasmine had ever seen him. "Jasmine, we need to talk immediately. The Attorney General's office just called. They're launching a formal Civil Rights Division investigation into the courthouse security practices, with your case as the catalyst." The implications were staggering. What had begun as a morning's humiliation had evolved into a federal investigation that could reshape how security was handled in courthouses across America. Agent Henderson, who had remained in the chambers during Williams's visit, stepped forward. "Judge Coleman, this investigation will be comprehensive. We'll be looking at hiring practices, training protocols, complaint procedures, and supervisory oversight. Your case has opened the door to examine systemic issues that have been ignored for too long." As the day wore on, more details emerged about Stevens's background and behavior. His personnel file revealed a troubling pattern that went beyond the courthouse incidents. During his previous job as a city police officer, he had been involved in 3 excessive force complaints, all involving black suspects. He had been transferred to courthouse security after a controversial arrest that had resulted in a civil rights lawsuit. "This man should never have been in a position of authority over courthouse access," Hughes said as they reviewed Stevens's complete record. "The hiring process failed, the supervision failed, and the complaint process failed." By late afternoon, the political ramifications had reached the highest levels. Senator Elizabeth Warren's office issued a statement calling for congressional hearings on racial bias in federal law enforcement. The Congressional Black Caucus announced plans for legislation requiring diversity training for all federal courthouse personnel. But perhaps the most significant development came when Commissioner David Fletcher, who oversaw courthouse security for the entire federal district, submitted his resignation. Commissioner Fletcher acknowledges that the systemic failures that led to Judge Coleman's mistreatment occurred under his leadership, read the official statement from the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts. His resignation is effective immediately, and an interim commissioner will implement comprehensive reforms. As Jasmine prepared to leave the courthouse that evening, she reflected on the whirlwind of activity that had consumed the past 36 hours. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Watch the news again today. I'm proud of how you're handling this, but I'm sorry you have to go through it. Change is hard, but you're strong enough to lead it." The message reminded Jasmine that this incident was about more than her personal experience. It was about every black professional who had been questioned, doubted, or dismissed because their appearance didn't match someone's narrow expectations of authority and competence. Walking through the courthouse lobby where the confrontation had occurred, Jasmine noticed that new signs had already been posted outlining proper identification verification procedures. A diverse group of security officers was stationed at the elevators, and their interactions with visitors appeared more respectful and professional. But she also knew that real change would take more than new signs and temporary attention. It would require sustained commitment to examining and addressing the unconscious biases that allowed incidents like hers to occur in the first place. As her car pulled away from the courthouse, Jasmine saw Stevens's interview playing on the news screens in nearby restaurants and bars. His defiant denial of wrongdoing had become a symbol of institutional resistance to acknowledging discrimination, even when confronted with overwhelming evidence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, including the formal beginning of the federal investigation and increased media scrutiny of her every move. But tonight, Jasmine allowed herself to feel cautiously optimistic that her humiliating experience might actually lead to meaningful change for others who would follow in her footsteps. The question now was whether the attention and outrage would translate into lasting reform, or whether the system would eventually return to its comfortable patterns once the cameras moved on to other stories. 3 weeks after the elevator incident, Jasmine sat in her chambers reviewing a motion that would have seemed impossible just a month earlier. The Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division had filed a comprehensive federal lawsuit against the courthouse security system, with her case as the primary example of systemic discrimination. The lawsuit named not only Officer Stevens but also his supervisors, the security contractor, and the administrative office of the U.S. courts. It alleged a pattern of civil rights violations and sought both monetary damages and sweeping institutional reforms. Judge Coleman, her law clerk Claire said, entering with a stack of legal documents, "The media requests are still pouring in. 60 Minutes wants an exclusive interview, and Harvard Law Review is asking you to write a first-person account of the incident." Jasmine sighed, setting down the motion she'd been reading. "Schedule the Harvard Law Review meeting. If I'm going to tell this story, it should be in a forum that reaches legal professionals who can actually implement change." The past 3 weeks had transformed her life in ways she never could have anticipated. She had become the reluctant face of a national conversation about racial bias in the justice system, a role that came with both opportunities and burdens she was still learning to navigate. Her phone rang with a call from attorney Lisa Henderson, the civil rights lawyer who had taken on her case pro bono. Henderson was a formidable advocate who had successfully prosecuted numerous high-profile discrimination cases. "Jasmine," Henderson said, using her first name as their professional relationship had evolved into friendship, "we've received Stevens's response to the federal charges. His attorney is claiming qualified immunity and arguing that he was acting within his official capacity." "Of course they are," Jasmine replied. "What about the civil lawsuit?" "That's more interesting. The courthouse security contractor wants to settle quickly and quietly. They're terrified of the publicity and the potential for punitive damages. Their insurance company is pushing hard for resolution." The prospect of a settlement was tempting from a practical standpoint, but Jasmine had concerns about the broader implications. "If we settle quietly, does that prevent the systemic changes we're fighting for?" "Not necessarily," Henderson explained. "The Department of Justice's investigation is separate from our civil case. They can continue pursuing institutional reforms even if we reach a financial settlement with the private parties." As they discussed strategy, Jasmine's assistant announced that Chief Judge Hughes needed to see her immediately. The urgency in the message was unusual, prompting her to excuse herself from the phone call and hurry to Hughes's chambers. She found Hughes meeting with Judge Patricia Collins from the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals and Attorney General Michael Thompson, who had arrived from Washington without any advance notice. "Jasmine," Attorney General Thompson said, rising to greet her, "thank you for making time on short notice. We need to discuss some developments in the federal investigation." The gravity of the situation was immediately apparent. The Attorney General didn't make unannounced visits to discuss routine matters. "The investigation has uncovered evidence of discrimination that goes far beyond Officer Stevens," Thompson continued once they were all seated. "We've identified similar patterns in federal courthouses in at least 12 other districts. Your case has opened the door to examining a nationwide problem." Judge Collins leaned forward. "Jasmine, the Judicial Conference of the United States has asked me to chair a special committee on courthouse security and judicial access. We want you to serve on that committee." The invitation was both an honor and a significant responsibility. The Judicial Conference was the policy-making body for the federal court system, and serving on a special committee would give Jasmine direct influence over nationwide reforms. "I'm honored by the invitation," Jasmine replied carefully, "but I want to make sure my participation doesn't compromise the ongoing legal proceedings." "Actually, your involvement would strengthen both efforts," Attorney General Thompson said. "Your first-hand experience and legal expertise make you uniquely qualified to help design solutions that address the root causes of these problems." As they discussed the scope of the committee's work, Jasmine began to understand the magnitude of what they were proposing. The investigation had revealed that her experience was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of discrimination that affected courthouses across the country. Later that afternoon, as Jasmine reviewed the committee materials, Claire entered with news that would add another layer of complexity to the situation. "Judge Coleman, Officer Stevens just filed a counter-lawsuit. He's claiming defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. He's asking for damages and alleging that the video coverage violated his privacy rights." The audacity of the counter-lawsuit was breathtaking. Stevens was essentially arguing that being held accountable for his discriminatory behavior had damaged his reputation and caused him emotional harm. "His attorney must be desperate," Jasmine said, shaking her head. "That lawsuit has no merit, but it shows they're going to fight this aggressively." The counter-lawsuit generated immediate media attention and public outrage. Legal experts across the country appeared on news programs to explain why Stevens's claims were frivolous and potentially sanctionable. Professor Angela Davis from UCLA Law School summed up the general reaction during an interview on CNN. "Officer Stevens is essentially arguing that facing consequences for discriminatory behavior is a form of harassment. It's a perfect example of how privilege operates. When you're accustomed to acting without accountability, equality feels like oppression." The public response to Stevens's counter-lawsuit was swift and decisive. Within hours, social media was filled with expressions of outrage and support for Jasmine. The hashtag #StandWithJudgeColeman began trending nationally, and legal advocacy organizations issued statements condemning Stevens' legal strategy. But the counter-lawsuit also had an unintended consequence. It brought additional scrutiny to Stevens's background and behavior. Investigative reporters began digging deeper into his employment history, uncovering additional incidents of questionable conduct that had not previously been made public. A former colleague from Stevens's police department days came forward with allegations that Stevens had routinely used racial slurs and had expressed racist views about crime and punishment. Video footage from his police car camera showed him making inappropriate comments during traffic stops involving black drivers. "This new evidence is devastating to Stevens's credibility," Attorney Henderson told Jasmine during their evening strategy call. "His counter-lawsuit has backfired spectacularly. We're now in a position to seek sanctions against him and his attorney for filing a frivolous lawsuit." As the legal battle intensified, Jasmine found herself navigating an increasingly complex landscape of public attention, legal strategy, and personal privacy concerns. Death threats had increased to the point where she now required a security detail, an ironic twist given that the original incident had involved courthouse security. Her mother called that evening, as she did every night since the incident became public. "Baby girl, I saw on the news that man is trying to sue you now. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Mama," Jasmine assured her. "He doesn't have a case. His lawyers are just trying to intimidate me into backing down." "Well, they don't know my daughter very well then," Gloria replied with fierce pride. "You've never backed down from a fight when you were in the right, and you're not going to start now." The conversation reminded Jasmine of why this battle was important beyond her personal vindication. It was about ensuring that other young black professionals wouldn't face the same barriers and humiliations she had encountered throughout her career. Late that night, as Jasmine prepared for bed in her downtown Detroit apartment, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that Tuesday morning 3 weeks ago. She had gone from being a relatively anonymous federal judge to a national symbol of resistance to discrimination. The transformation had been neither sought nor welcomed, but she was determined to use her unwanted platform to create lasting change. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, including her first committee meeting and continued legal proceedings, but she felt ready for whatever came next. The battle was far from over, but the momentum was clearly on the side of justice and reform. Officer Stevens's counter-lawsuit would likely be dismissed quickly, while the federal investigation continued to uncover evidence of systemic discrimination that demanded comprehensive solutions. As she drifted off to sleep, Jasmine thought about all the young black lawyers and judges who would benefit from the changes her case had set in motion. The humiliation she had endured would serve a purpose if it prevented others from facing similar treatment in the halls of justice. The story of Judge Coleman's confrontation with Officer Stevens had taken on a life of its own in the media landscape. What began as viral social media videos had evolved into a comprehensive examination of racial bias in America's justice system, with Jasmine reluctantly at the center of a national conversation she never wanted to join. CNN's primetime special, Justice Denied Racism in America's Courthouses featured extensive interviews with courthouse employees, legal experts, and civil rights leaders. The program revealed similar incidents in federal buildings across the country, painting a picture of systemic discrimination that extended far beyond Detroit. Anderson Cooper's interview with Jasmine had been watched by over 15 million viewers, making it one of the highest-rated news programs of the year. Her calm, articulate responses to difficult questions had earned widespread praise, but also subjected her to increased scrutiny from critics who questioned everything from her qualifications to her motivations. "Judge Coleman," Cooper had asked during the interview, "some critics argue that you're using this incident to advance a political agenda. How do you respond to that?" Jasmine's response had been measured but firm. "Anderson, I didn't choose to become a symbol of anything. I was simply trying to get to my chambers to do my job. The fact that Officer Stevens's discrimination was captured on video and went viral doesn't mean I sought publicity. It means that what happened to me happens to others every day, but usually without witnesses or cameras." The interview had generated intense discussion on social media, with supporters praising her dignity and critics questioning her decision to pursue legal action. The divide largely fell along predictable lines, with conservative commentators arguing she was oversensitive and liberal voices calling her a hero for standing up to discrimination. Fox News host Tucker Carlson had devoted an entire segment to questioning Jasmine's record and suggesting that the incident had been overblown. "Judge Coleman seems determined to see racism everywhere," Carlson declared to his audience. "Maybe Officer Stevens was just doing his job and didn't recognize someone he'd never seen before." The segment had prompted immediate backlash from legal organizations and civil rights groups, but it also illustrated how polarized the public response had become. Jasmine found herself defended by people she'd never met and attacked by others who knew nothing about her beyond what they'd seen in news coverage. The media attention had also brought unwanted scrutiny to her family and personal life. Reporters had tracked down her childhood friends from the South Side of Chicago, her law school classmates, and even her former grocery store co-workers from her college summer jobs. The coverage was generally positive, portraying her as a success story of determination and excellence, but the invasion of privacy was nonetheless unsettling. Her mother, Gloria, had been approached by multiple news organizations offering payment for exclusive interviews about raising a future federal judge in the housing projects. To her credit, Gloria had declined all such requests, telling one persistent reporter, "My daughter's story speaks for itself. I don't need to profit from her pain." The social media response had been particularly intense and often disturbing. Supportive messages from fellow legal professionals, civil rights advocates, and ordinary citizens who had experienced similar discrimination provided encouragement. But the hate mail and death threats required constant monitoring by law enforcement. One particularly vicious email, forwarded to her by courthouse security, read, "You think you're something special because you wear a black robe? You don't belong on any federal bench. We know where you live and we know where you work. Watch your back." The FBI had traced the message to a white supremacist group in rural Michigan and made arrests, but the threat remained real enough that Jasmine's security detail had been expanded to include protection for her mother as well. Despite the negative attention, the overwhelming public response had been supportive. The NAACP had organized rallies in 12 major cities calling for justice system reforms. The American Bar Association had passed a resolution condemning discrimination against judges and legal professionals. Law schools across the country had invited Jasmine to speak, though she had been advised by security to limit her public appearances. Harvard Law School, her alma mater, had announced plans to establish the Jasmine Coleman Fellowship for students pursuing careers in civil rights law. The honor was gratifying, but also reminded her that her personal ordeal had become larger than herself. The media coverage had also sparked important conversations within the legal profession itself. Bar associations in multiple states had begun conducting surveys of their members about experiences with discrimination in courthouses and legal settings. The results were sobering. Over 60% of Black attorneys reported experiencing some form of discrimination in professional settings, and nearly 40% said they had been questioned about their right to be in courtrooms or judicial chambers. Judge Robert Franklin, a respected federal judge in Atlanta, had written an op-ed for the Washington Post sharing his own experiences with discrimination. Judge Coleman's dignity in the face of blatant racism reminds us all that the fight for equality in our justice system is far from over, he wrote. Every Black judge and lawyer has a similar story, but few have had the courage to make it public. The article had prompted dozens of other legal professionals to share their stories, creating a cascade of testimonials that illustrated the widespread nature of the problem Jasmine had inadvertently exposed. Television news programs began featuring regular segments on discrimination in professional settings, interviewing Black doctors who had been mistaken for orderlies, Black executives who had been questioned in corporate boardrooms, and Black professors who had been assumed to be students by their own colleagues. The coverage had created what media scholars called the Jasmine Coleman effect, a phenomenon where one highly publicized incident of discrimination prompted thousands of similar stories to emerge from people who had previously suffered in silence. But the media attention had also brought unexpected complications. Conservative legal organizations had begun scrutinizing every decision Jasmine had made from the bench, looking for evidence of bias or incompetence that might undermine her credibility. So far, they had found nothing questionable in her judicial record, but the scrutiny was constant and stressful. Talk radio hosts had made her a frequent target, with some suggesting that her appointment to the federal bench had been motivated by political correctness rather than qualifications. The attacks were predictable, but still painful, particularly when they questioned her mother's character or suggested that her success was undeserved. Late-night comedy shows had taken a different approach, with hosts like Stephen Colbert and Trevor Noah using the incident to highlight the absurdity of racial bias in professional settings. Their segments were supportive of Jasmine but also kept the story in the public consciousness longer than she would have preferred. Officer Stevens saw a Black woman in professional attire and assumed she couldn't possibly be a federal judge, Noah had joked during his opening monologue. I guess in his mind, federal judges all look like Antonin Scalia. The humor helped diffuse some of the tension surrounding the story, but Jasmine sometimes wished the entire incident could simply fade from public memory so she could return to the anonymity she had enjoyed as a judge. The international media had also picked up the story, with outlets in Europe, Africa, and Asia, using it as an example of persistent racism in American institutions. The coverage was generally sympathetic to Jasmine, but also served as an embarrassment to the United States on the global stage. A particularly thoughtful analysis in The Guardian had observed, Judge Coleman's experience illustrates how racism operates in contemporary America, not through explicit slurs or violence, but through assumptions about who belongs in positions of authority and who does not. As the weeks passed, Jasmine tried to maintain focus on her judicial duties while managing the constant media attention. She had hired a public relations consultant to help manage interview requests and coordinate her public statements, but she was careful to maintain control over her own narrative. Her decision to write a first-person account for Harvard Law Review would give her the opportunity to tell her story in her own words, without the filter of television interviews or newspaper reporting. The article would reach the legal community directly and would become part of the permanent record of this incident's impact on American jurisprudence. But even as she worked on the article, Jasmine knew that the media attention was both a blessing and a curse. It had brought necessary attention to systemic discrimination, but it had also made her a target for those who preferred the status quo. The question now was how long the public's attention would remain focused on these issues and whether the media coverage would translate into lasting change or simply become another forgotten news cycle in America's short attention span culture. 2 months after the incident, Jasmine found herself in a conference room in Washington, D.C., surrounded by some of the most influential figures in the federal judiciary. The Special Committee on Courthouse Security and Judicial Access had convened for its first formal session, and the agenda was ambitious. Nothing less than a comprehensive overhaul of security practices in federal buildings nationwide. Chief Judge Patricia Collins from the Sixth Circuit presided over the meeting with characteristic efficiency. The committee included representatives from every circuit court, the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts, the Federal Judicial Center, and law enforcement leadership from the Department of Justice. "Ladies and gentlemen," Collins began, "we're here because Judge Coleman's experience exposed systemic failures that can no longer be ignored. Our investigation has revealed similar incidents in 43 federal districts across the country. The scope of the problem was even more extensive than Jasmine had imagined. The committee's preliminary report detailed hundreds of complaints from judges, attorneys, and court personnel who had faced discrimination or unprofessional treatment from security staff. The pattern was consistent. Black and Hispanic legal professionals were questioned, challenged, and subjected to additional scrutiny at rates far exceeding their white counterparts. Agent Jennifer Martinez from the FBI's Civil Rights Division presented the most damning evidence. Our analysis of courthouse security footage from the past 3 years shows clear disparities in how visitors are treated based on race and apparent social class," she reported. "Black attorneys are 400% more likely to be asked for additional identification, and black judges, even those who work in the building daily, face questioning at rates 20 times higher than white judges." The statistics were sobering, but Jasmine was more interested in the solutions being proposed. Attorney General Thompson had given the committee broad authority to implement immediate changes while developing long-term reforms. "Judge Coleman," Collins said, turning to her, "we'd like you to chair the subcommittee on training and accountability. Your experience gives you unique insight into both the problems and potential solutions." Jasmine accepted the responsibility with mixed feelings. She wanted to contribute to meaningful change, but she also recognized that taking on this role would further cement her identity as the face of courthouse discrimination reform rather than simply allowing her to return to being a judge. The training subcommittee's mandate was comprehensive: develop new protocols for security screening, create bias awareness training for all courthouse personnel, establish clear procedures for handling discrimination complaints, and design accountability measures that would prevent incidents like hers from recurring. Over the following weeks, Jasmine worked with experts from across the country to design training programs that went beyond simple sensitivity sessions. The new protocols would require security personnel to complete 40 hours of professional development annually, including modules on implicit bias, constitutional rights, and appropriate interaction with legal professionals. "We can't just tell people not to be racist," explained Dr. Beverly Johnson, a psychologist who specialized in bias training. "We have to help them recognize their unconscious assumptions and provide them with tools to make decisions based on objective criteria rather than subjective impressions." The training would be mandatory for all federal courthouse security personnel, from contractors to federal marshals. Failure to complete the training would result in immediate suspension, and repeated violations of the new protocols would lead to permanent dismissal. But training was only part of the solution. The committee also developed new physical security procedures that would reduce opportunities for discriminatory treatment. Electronic identification scanners would verify credentials automatically, reducing the need for subjective judgments by security personnel. Clear signage would outline the rights and procedures for all courthouse visitors. Video monitoring would be enhanced to ensure that inappropriate behavior could be documented and addressed quickly. Perhaps most importantly, The committee established an independent oversight office that would investigate discrimination complaints and ensure that violations had real consequences. The office would be staffed by civil rights attorneys and would report directly to the administrative office of the U.S. courts, bypassing the local management structure that had allowed problems like Officer Stevens to persist. As these reforms were being developed, Jasmine continued to face the ongoing legal proceedings from her own case. Officer Stevens had withdrawn his frivolous counter-lawsuit after his attorney realized it was likely to result in sanctions, but his criminal trial for civil rights violations was moving forward. The trial had become a cause célèbre for civil rights advocates, who saw it as a crucial test of whether law enforcement officers could be held accountable for discriminatory behavior. Conversely, police unions and conservative legal organizations were closely monitoring the case, concerned about the precedent it might set for prosecuting officers based on their interactions with minorities. Jury selection had been particularly challenging, as nearly every potential juror had seen the viral videos of the incident. The defense team, led by attorney Robert Steinberg, had requested a change of venue, arguing that Stevens couldn't receive a fair trial in Detroit due to the extensive media coverage. Federal District Judge Margaret Williams had denied the venue change motion, ruling that the publicity, while extensive, had not been so prejudicial as to make a fair trial impossible. The defendant's actions were captured on video from multiple angles, Judge Williams noted in her order. The challenge is not finding jurors who haven't seen the footage, but finding jurors who can evaluate the evidence objectively despite their prior knowledge. The prosecution team, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney David Chen, had built their case around the video evidence and the pattern of discriminatory behavior revealed in the federal investigation. They planned to call multiple witnesses who had experienced similar treatment from Stevens, demonstrating that his confrontation with Jasmine was not an isolated incident but part of a consistent pattern of bias. The evidence will show that Officer Stevens acted with deliberate indifference to Judge Coleman's constitutional rights, Chen had argued during pretrial motions. His behavior was motivated by racial animus and his belief that someone who looked like Judge Coleman couldn't possibly hold the position she holds. The defense strategy was predictable but problematic. Steinberg would argue that Stevens was simply following security protocols and that his actions were not motivated by racial bias, but by legitimate security concerns. However, this strategy was undermined by Stevens's own statements during the incident, which had been clearly captured on video. "My client may have made mistakes in judgment," Steinberg conceded during a pretrial interview, "but mistakes are not crimes. The prosecution must prove intentional discrimination, and that's a very high bar to meet." Legal experts were divided on the likely outcome of the trial. Civil rights attorneys argued that the video evidence was so clear and Stevens's statements so obviously discriminatory that conviction was inevitable. Criminal defense attorneys countered that proving intent beyond a reasonable doubt remained challenging, particularly in cases involving law enforcement officers. As the trial date approached, Jasmine found herself preparing to testify against Stevens, a prospect that filled her with both anticipation and dread. She wanted justice, but she also knew that taking the witness stand would subject her to cross-examination by Stevens's attorneys, who would likely attempt to portray her as oversensitive or agenda-driven. The trial would also be closely watched by the legal community, as it would be one of the first criminal prosecutions of a law enforcement officer for discrimination against a federal judge. The outcome could set important precedents for how such cases were handled in the future. Meanwhile, the civil lawsuit against the security contractor and courthouse management was moving toward settlement. The defendants had made increasingly generous offers, recognizing that their liability was clear and their exposure to punitive damages was substantial. "They want to settle for 8 figures, Attorney Henderson told Jasmine during a strategy session. "It's more money than you'll ever need, and it would allow you to avoid the continued publicity of a trial." Jasmine was torn about the settlement offer. The money would provide security for her and her mother, and it would allow her to focus on judicial duties rather than legal proceedings. But she was also concerned that a confidential settlement might prevent the full truth about the courthouse security problems from being revealed. "What about the systemic changes we've been fighting for?" she asked Henderson. "Those will continue regardless of whether we settle your individual case," Henderson assured her. "The Department of Justice investigation is separate from our civil lawsuit. The reforms you're working on through the Judicial Committee will proceed no matter what we decide about the settlement." The decision weighed heavily on Jasmine as she considered both the personal and public implications of her choice. She had become a reluctant public figure, but she also recognized the responsibility that came with her platform. As she sat in her chambers late one evening, reviewing the settlement documents, Jasmine reflected on how much her life had changed since that Tuesday morning when Officer Stevens had blocked her access to the elevator. She had gone from being an anonymous federal judge to a national symbol of the fight against institutional discrimination. The transformation had been neither sought nor welcomed, but it had also provided her with an opportunity to create lasting change that would benefit others who might face similar challenges in the future. Tomorrow would bring new decisions about the settlement, continued work on the Reform Committee, and ongoing preparation for the criminal trial. But tonight, she allowed herself to feel cautiously optimistic that her painful experience was contributing to meaningful progress in America's ongoing struggle for equal justice. The criminal trial of Officer Bradley Stevens began on a gray Monday morning in November, exactly 6 months after his confrontation with Judge Coleman. The federal courthouse in Detroit had been transformed into a media circus, with satellite trucks lining the streets and reporters from national news organizations competing for the best positions to capture arrivals and departures. Jasmine arrived at the courthouse 90 minutes before her scheduled testimony, using a side entrance to avoid the cameras. The irony was not lost on her. She was returning to testify in the same building where Stevens had denied her access, but now she was accompanied by a security detail that ensured her safe passage. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow seating arranged in adjacent rooms equipped with video feeds. Judge Margaret Williams, known for her no-nonsense approach to courtroom management, had implemented strict rules about recording and photography, but the intense public interest was palpable. Assistant U.S. Attorney David Chen opened for the prosecution with a clear, methodical presentation of the evidence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this case is about a federal law enforcement officer who violated his oath and the constitutional rights of a distinguished federal judge because he couldn't accept that someone who looked like her could hold such a position of authority." Chen played the viral videos from multiple angles, narrating Stevens's actions and statements. The footage was even more damaging in the formal courtroom setting than it had been on social media, with Stevens's discriminatory comments echoing through the silent chamber. "You will hear Officer Stevens tell Judge Coleman that she doesn't look like any judge he's ever seen," Chen continued. "You will hear him refuse to accept her valid judicial identification. You will hear him threaten to have her arrested for the crime of insisting on her constitutional right to equal treatment." The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Witness after witness testified about Stevens's pattern of discriminatory behavior. Calvin, the security guard who had tried to intervene during the original incident, described multiple occasions when Stevens had treated black courthouse employees and visitors with disrespect and suspicion. Officer Stevens would make comments about people not belonging in certain areas of the building, Calvin testified. When I pointed out that they had proper credentials, he would say things like, "You never know who's trying to scam their way in here." A black court reporter named Sharon Davis testified about being repeatedly questioned by Stevens about her presence in restricted areas, despite having worked in the courthouse for over 8 years. "He would ask to see my ID every single day," she said. "My white colleagues were never asked for identification, even when they were new employees." The most powerful testimony came from Dr. Marcus Jefferson, a prominent civil rights attorney who had been subjected to additional security screening by Stevens during a high-profile hearing. "Officer Stevens made me empty my briefcase and submit to a pat-down search," Jefferson testified. "When I asked why I was being singled out, he said courthouse security required extra precautions with certain types of people." When it was Jasmine's turn to testify, the courtroom fell completely silent. She walked to the witness stand with the same dignity she had displayed during the original confrontation, her voice steady and clear as she recounted the events of that Tuesday morning. "I identified myself as Judge Coleman and showed my judicial identification card," she testified. Officer Stevens barely looked at it before dismissing it as potentially fake. He made it clear that he didn't believe someone who looked like me could be a federal judge. Under cross-examination by defense attorney Robert Steinberg, Jasmine faced aggressive questioning designed to undermine her credibility and suggest that she had overreacted to the situation. "Judge Coleman," Steinberg asked, "isn't it true that you were running late that morning and might have been impatient with normal security procedures?" "I was not running late," Jasmine replied calmly. "I arrived at my usual time and was simply trying to access the elevator that I use every day to reach my chambers. There was nothing normal about Officer Stevens's behavior that morning." Steinberg pressed harder. "But you admit that you became argumentative when Officer Stevens was simply trying to do his job." "I became firm when Officer Stevens refused to accept my valid identification and threatened to have me arrested," Jasmine corrected. "Standing up for my constitutional rights is not being argumentative." The cross-examination continued for over 2 hours, but Steinberg was unable to shake Jasmine's testimony or suggest any legitimate reason for Stevens's behavior. Her responses were measured, factual, and devastating to the defense's case. The defense strategy centered on portraying Stevens as a dedicated officer who had made an honest mistake in a high-security environment. Character witnesses testified about his years of service and his dedication to courthouse safety. His attorney argued that the confrontation was simply a misunderstanding that had been blown out of proportion. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steinberg argued during closing statements, "Officer Stevens made an error in judgment, but errors are not crimes. In today's security environment, courthouse personnel must be vigilant about potential threats. My client was being cautious, not discriminatory." But the argument fell flat when confronted with the video evidence and Stevens's own words. Prosecutor Chen's closing argument was devastating in its simplicity. The defendant told Judge Coleman she didn't look like any judge he'd ever seen, Chen reminded the jury. He refused to accept her valid judicial identification. He threatened to have her arrested when she insisted on her rights. "These are not the actions of someone concerned about security. These are the actions of someone who could not accept that a black woman could hold a position of federal authority." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Deprivation of civil rights under color of law, official misconduct, and violation of constitutional rights. Stevens showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but his wife could be heard sobbing in the gallery. Judge Williams scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, but legal experts predicted Stevens would face significant prison time. Federal civil rights violations carried mandatory minimum sentences, and Stevens's lack of remorse throughout the trial had likely damaged any chance for leniency. The verdict made national headlines and was hailed by civil rights organizations as a landmark victory for accountability in law enforcement. NAACP President Derek Johnson issued a statement saying, "Officer Stevens's conviction sends a clear message that discrimination by law enforcement officers will not be tolerated, regardless of the victim's race or the officer's claimed justifications." But the victory was not without controversy. Police unions condemned the verdict as criminalizing split-second decisions made by officers in difficult circumstances. The Fraternal Order of Police issued a statement warning that the conviction would make officers afraid to do their jobs effectively. Conservative commentators argued that the prosecution had been motivated by political correctness rather than justice. Fox News host Tucker Carlson devoted an entire segment to defending Stevens, arguing that he had been railroaded by a politically motivated prosecution designed to appease the liberal mob. The criticism stung, but Jasmine was more focused on the broader implications of the verdict. It represented the first successful federal prosecution of a law enforcement officer for discriminating against a federal judge, setting an important precedent for future cases. More significantly, the trial had provided a public forum for examining the systemic nature of discrimination in federal courthouses. The testimony from multiple witnesses had illustrated that Stevens's behavior was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of bias that affected courthouses nationwide. The civil lawsuit reached its conclusion 2 weeks after the criminal verdict. The security contractor, courthouse management company, and federal government agreed to a settlement that would provide Jasmine with financial compensation while funding comprehensive reforms to courthouse security practices nationwide. The settlement amount was not disclosed, but sources familiar with the negotiations suggested it was among the largest civil rights settlements in federal court history. More importantly for Jasmine, the settlement required the defendants to implement the reform recommendations developed by her judicial committee and provide funding for their nationwide implementation. This settlement ensures that what happened to Judge Coleman will lead to meaningful change, Attorney Henderson announced at a press conference. The reforms funded by this agreement will protect the constitutional rights of every person who enters a federal courthouse. The reforms were comprehensive and immediate. Within 90 days, every federal courthouse in the country would implement new identification verification procedures that reduced subjective decision-making by security personnel. Electronic scanners would verify credentials automatically, and clear protocols would govern interactions between security staff and legal professionals. All courthouse security personnel would complete 40 hours of mandatory bias awareness training, with annual recertification required to maintain their positions. An independent oversight office would investigate discrimination complaints and ensure that violations resulted in appropriate discipline. Perhaps most importantly, the settlement established a $50 million fund to support diversity and inclusion initiatives in federal courthouses nationwide. The money would fund scholarships for minority law students, support mentorship programs for young attorneys of color, and provide grants for courthouse accessibility improvements. Stevens's sentencing hearing 3 weeks later drew almost as much attention as his trial. Federal sentencing guidelines called for 18 months to 3 years in prison, but prosecutors asked for the maximum sentence based on Stevens's lack of remorse and the severity of his constitutional violations. Your Honor, Prosecutor Chen argued, the defendant has shown no recognition of the harm he caused or the constitutional rights he violated. He continues to maintain that he did nothing wrong, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. A significant sentence is necessary to deter similar conduct by other law enforcement officers. Stevens's attorney pleaded for leniency, arguing that his client had already suffered enough through the loss of his job and public humiliation. Officer Stevens has been destroyed by this incident, Steinberg argued. His career is over, his reputation is ruined, and his family has suffered tremendously. Prison time would be excessive punishment for what was essentially an error in judgment. But Judge Williams was unmoved by the plea for mercy. Mr. Stevens, she said, addressing the defendant directly, you violated the constitutional rights of a federal judge in a manner that was both deliberate and discriminatory. Your actions struck at the heart of our justice system and the principle of equal treatment under law. Stevens was sentenced to 2.5 years in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release. He was also ordered to complete 200 hours of community service in civil rights organizations and to attend bias awareness counseling. The sentence was hailed by civil rights advocates as appropriate and necessary, while law enforcement organizations continued to argue that it was excessive. But for Jasmine, the sentence represented closure on a chapter of her life that she was ready to put behind her. As she left the courthouse after the sentencing hearing, Jasmine reflected on the long journey from that humiliating morning 6 months earlier to this moment of accountability and justice. The process had been painful, exhausting, and invasive of her privacy, but it had also resulted in meaningful changes that would benefit countless others. The reforms funded by the settlement were already being implemented in courthouses across the country. Training programs were being redesigned, oversight procedures were being strengthened, and accountability mechanisms were being put in place to prevent future incidents of discrimination. Stevens would serve his time and eventually be released, hopefully having learned something about the constitutional rights he had violated. But more importantly, his conviction had sent a clear message that discrimination by law enforcement officers would not be tolerated, regardless of their claimed justifications or the race of their victims. The legal proceedings were finally over, but Jasmine's work on behalf of equal justice was just beginning. Her role on the Judicial Reform Committee would continue, and she had been invited to speak at law schools and conferences about her experience and the changes it had prompted. She had never wanted to be a symbol or a public figure, but she had accepted the responsibility that came with her platform. If her painful experience could prevent others from facing similar discrimination, then the humiliation and invasion of privacy had served a purpose. 1 year after the elevator incident that changed her life, Judge Jasmine Coleman stood before a packed auditorium at Harvard Law School, delivering the annual Civil Rights Lecture to an audience of students, faculty, and distinguished guests. The woman who had been denied access to an elevator because she didn't look like a judge was now recognized as one of the most influential voices in the fight for equal justice. "When Officer Stevens blocked my access to that elevator," Jasmine told the audience, "he wasn't just questioning my credentials. He was questioning whether someone who looked like me belonged in the halls of American justice. His actions that morning reflected assumptions and biases that have plagued our legal system for generations." The auditorium was silent as she continued. But what happened next? The investigation, the trial, the reforms, that showed the power of accountability and the possibility of change when institutions are forced to confront their failures. The past year had been transformative for both Jasmine personally and for the federal court system as a whole. The reforms implemented as a result of her case had already shown measurable results. Discrimination complaints in federal courthouses had increased by 400%, but that was viewed as positive development. People who had previously suffered in silence now felt empowered to report inappropriate treatment. More importantly, substantiated complaints were being addressed swiftly and appropriately. In the first year after the new oversight office began operations, 43 security personnel had been terminated for discriminatory behavior, and hundreds more had been disciplined or required to complete additional training. Dr. Beverly Johnson, the psychologist who had helped design the bias awareness training programs, reported encouraging results from the mandatory education initiatives. "We're seeing measurable changes in behavior and attitudes," she told a conference of court administrators. "Officers who complete our training show significantly less discriminatory behavior in subsequent interactions." The electronic identification systems had been particularly effective in reducing subjective decision-making by security personnel. Automated scanners now verified credentials instantly, eliminating opportunities for officers to make biased judgments about who belonged in courthouse facilities. But the changes went beyond technical fixes and training programs. The culture within federal courthouses had begun to shift, with senior judges and administrators making it clear that discrimination would not be tolerated. Chief Judge Hughes had made diversity and inclusion a priority for his district, regularly meeting with minority employees and bar associations to ensure that problems were identified and addressed quickly. Judge Coleman's experience was a wake-up call for all of us, Hughes told a gathering of federal judges from across the country. "We realized that we had been failing in our most basic obligation, to ensure that our courthouses truly served as halls of justice for everyone." The impact extended far beyond the federal court system. state, and local courthouse systems had voluntarily implemented similar reforms, recognizing that the problems exposed by Jasmine's case were not unique to federal facilities. Law enforcement agencies across the country had revised their training programs to address implicit bias, and several had invited Jasmine to speak to their personnel about the importance of treating all citizens with dignity and respect. The academic response had been equally significant. Law schools had integrated her case study into their curricula, using it to teach future attorneys about civil rights, professional ethics, and the ongoing challenges of achieving equal justice. The Jasmine Coleman Fellowship at Harvard Law School had provided full scholarships to 12 students from underrepresented communities, with recipients committed to careers in civil rights law. Judge Coleman's courage in standing up to discrimination has inspired a new generation of civil rights advocates, said Professor Angela Davis, who directed the fellowship program. These students understand that the fight for equal justice requires constant vigilance and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about our legal system. The media coverage had also evolved over the year, moving beyond the initial sensationalism to focus on substantive issues of justice and equality. Major news organizations had launched investigative series examining discrimination in various professional settings, with Jasmine's case serving as a catalyst for broader examinations of institutional bias. A Pulitzer Prize-winning series by The Washington Post had documented similar incidents in courthouses, police stations, hospitals, and corporate offices across the country, revealing that Jasmine's experience was part of a much larger pattern of discrimination faced by professionals of color in positions of authority. Officer Stevens had served 8 months of his sentence before being released to a halfway house where he was required to complete community service at a civil rights organization. Reports from his supervisors suggested that he was finally beginning to understand the impact of his actions, though he had not made any public statements of remorse or responsibility. His conviction had become a landmark case in civil rights law, frequently cited in legal briefs and court decisions involving discrimination by law enforcement officers. Legal scholars predicted that the precedent would make it easier to prosecute similar cases in the future, providing a deterrent effect that would protect others from discriminatory treatment. The financial settlement from Jasmine's civil lawsuit had been put to good use. Beyond the reforms it funded, she had donated significant portions to organizations working to increase diversity in the legal profession and to support young people from underrepresented communities who aspired to careers in law. "I never wanted to profit from discrimination," Jasmine explained during an interview with legal journalist Jeffrey Toobin. "The money should be used to create opportunities for others and to ensure that what happened to me becomes increasingly rare rather than routine." Her mother, Gloria, had been able to retire from her healthcare job, though she chose to continue working part-time because she enjoyed helping elderly residents. The security that the settlement provided had been a relief for both women, who had worried about finances throughout Jasmine's educational journey. "My daughter has always used her blessings to help others," Gloria told Essence magazine during a rare interview. "I'm proud of how she's handled this situation, but I'm not surprised. She's been standing up for what's right since she was a little girl." The personal toll of the past year had been significant but manageable. Jasmine had received death threats and faced constant scrutiny of her judicial decisions, but she had also received thousands of messages of support from people who had been inspired by her courage. The hate mail had gradually decreased, while the positive responses continued to arrive regularly. Her judicial work had continued throughout the year, with Jasmine maintaining her full caseload and earning recognition for the quality and fairness of her decisions. Several of her rulings had been cited approvingly by appellate courts, and legal publications had praised her careful legal analysis and balanced approach to sentencing. Judge Coleman has proven that her commitment to equal justice extends far beyond her own experience, wrote the editor of Federal Courts Review. Her judicial decisions reflect the same principles of fairness and dignity that she demanded for herself during her confrontation with discrimination. The speaking engagements had continued throughout the year, with Jasmine addressing bar associations, civil rights organizations, law enforcement groups, and academic institutions across the country. She had been careful to focus her remarks on systemic issues rather than personal grievances, using her platform to advocate for broader reforms in the justice system. Her Harvard Law Review article about the incident had become one of the most cited legal publications of the year, required reading in civil rights courses at law schools nationwide. The article had carefully analyzed the legal and societal factors that allowed discrimination to persist in professional settings, offering concrete recommendations for addressing institutional bias. "The law alone cannot eliminate discrimination," she had written, "but legal accountability can create incentives for institutions to examine their practices and implement meaningful reforms. Change requires both individual courage and systematic commitment to equality." As her Harvard lecture concluded, the audience rose in sustained applause that lasted several minutes. During the question and answer session that followed, a young black woman in her first year of law school asked the question that Jasmine had been expecting. "Judge Coleman, do you ever regret pursuing this case so aggressively? Would it have been easier to just accept the apology and move on?" Jasmine's response came without hesitation. "I've learned that discrimination thrives in silence and withers under scrutiny. If I had accepted a quiet apology and moved on, Officer Stevens would still be working at that courthouse, probably treating other people the same way he treated me. The investigation, the trial, the reforms, they were painful and invasive, but they were also necessary." She paused, looking directly at the young woman who had asked the question. "Your generation of lawyers will inherit a legal system that is more accountable and more equitable because of the changes that resulted from this case. That makes everything I went through worthwhile." As she left Harvard that evening, Jasmine reflected on how much her life had changed since that Tuesday morning when Officer Stevens had blocked her access to an elevator. She had reluctantly become a public figure and a symbol of resistance to discrimination, roles she had never sought but had ultimately embraced. The reforms were working, the precedent was established, and the conversation about equal justice had been advanced in meaningful ways. But perhaps most importantly, young lawyers and judges of color would face fewer barriers and less discrimination because of the accountability that had been demanded and achieved. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Calvin, the security guard who had tried to help her during the original confrontation. "Judge Coleman saw your speech on C-SPAN. Thank you for making our workplace better for everyone." The message reminded Jasmine that the real measure of her case's success wouldn't be found in legal precedents or media coverage, but in the daily experiences of the people who worked in federal courthouses across the country. If they could do their jobs with dignity and respect, regardless of their race or background, then her painful journey had served its purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to advance the cause of equal justice. But tonight, Jasmine allowed herself to feel proud of what had been accomplished and optimistic about what still lay ahead in America's ongoing struggle to live up to its highest ideals. 3 years had passed since the elevator incident, and Judge Jasmine Coleman had evolved from reluctant symbol to powerful advocate for systemic change in America's justice system. Her chambers remained on the 8th floor of the Detroit Federal Courthouse, but her influence now extended far beyond the cases that appeared before her bench. The morning sun streamed through her office windows as she prepared for another day that would combine judicial duties with her ongoing advocacy work. Her calendar showed a familiar mix: morning arraignments, afternoon sentencing hearings, and an evening speech to the National Association of Women Judges about combating discrimination in the legal profession. Her law clerk Claire, now in her 3rd year working with Jasmine, entered with the day's case files and a summary of developments from their ongoing civil rights initiatives. "Judge Coleman," Claire began, settling into her usual chair across from the desk, "the quarterly report from the Courthouse Oversight Office shows continued improvement. Discrimination complaints are down 60% from pre-reform levels, and satisfaction surveys from courthouse visitors show significant increases in positive ratings for security interactions. The numbers were encouraging, but Jasmine had learned not to become complacent about progress. Changing institutional culture was a long-term process that required constant vigilance and periodic reinforcement. "What about the training compliance rates?" she asked, reviewing the monthly statistics that tracked whether security personnel were completing their required bias awareness education. 97% compliance nationwide, Claire reported. The 3% who missed deadlines were all due to medical leave or other approved absences. No one has been permitted to work without current training certification. The accountability measures had proven crucial to maintaining the reforms. Unlike previous diversity initiatives that had been implemented with great fanfare but little follow-through, the changes resulting from Jasmine's case included specific metrics, regular monitoring, and clear consequences for non-compliance. A knock on the door interrupted their briefing. Chief Judge Hughes entered, his expression mixing pride with concern in a way that had become familiar over their 3 years of collaboration on justice system reforms. "Jasmine," he said, taking a seat, "I wanted to discuss the Riverside County situation before you hear about it from the media." Riverside County, California, had been the site of a troubling incident the previous week that echoed Jasmine's experience, but with even more disturbing circumstances. A black female prosecutor had been denied access to a courthouse elevator by a white security guard who assumed she was a defendant appearing for a hearing. Unlike Jasmine's case, however, the Riverside incident had escalated when the prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Sharon Williams, had become visibly angry at the discriminatory treatment. The security guard had called for backup and had her briefly detained, leading to headlines about a prosecutor being arrested at her own courthouse. "The videos are already going viral," Hughes continued, "and the civil rights organizations are calling it another Jasmine Coleman moment. The media is asking for your comment on the similarities between the cases." Jasmine sighed, recognizing the familiar pattern. Every incident of discrimination against a legal professional was now being compared to her experience, creating both opportunities and obligations she was still learning to navigate. "What's the prosecutor's situation?" she asked. "She's been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation, which is completely inappropriate given that she was the victim of discrimination," Hughes replied with obvious frustration. "The district attorney's office is more concerned about managing the controversy than protecting their employees' rights." The Riverside case illustrated both how much progress had been made and how much work remained to be done. The incident had been immediately recognized as discriminatory behavior rather than being dismissed as a misunderstanding, but the prosecutor was still being punished for standing up for her rights. "I'll issue a statement supporting Ms. Williams," Jasmine decided, "but I also want to connect her with our legal network to ensure she has proper representation if she decides to pursue a civil rights complaint." Over the past 3 years, Jasmine had helped establish an informal network of civil rights attorneys who specialized in discrimination cases involving legal professionals. The network provided pro bono representation to judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys who faced discriminatory treatment, ensuring that they had access to the same quality legal representation that Jasmine had received. The network had already handled over 200 cases, ranging from courthouse access issues to employment discrimination to professional misconduct allegations that appeared to be motivated by racial bias. The success rate had been impressive, with over 80% of cases resulting in favorable settlements or judgments for the victims. "The network attorneys are already reaching out to her," Hughes confirmed. "Attorney Henderson from your original case has volunteered to coordinate Ms. Williams' representation if she decides to pursue legal action." The mention of Attorney Henderson brought a smile to Jasmine's face. Lisa Henderson had become not just a legal advocate but a close friend and trusted advisor on civil rights matters. Together, they had developed a model for handling discrimination cases that emphasized both individual accountability and systemic change. The morning's first case interrupted their conversation as Bailiff Isaiah announced that court was ready to convene. Jasmine gathered her judicial robes, transforming from civil rights advocate back to federal judge, though the two roles had become increasingly intertwined over the years. The day's docket included the sentencing of Robert Whitman, a former police chief who had been convicted of systematically discriminating against black officers in his department. The case had drawn national attention because Whitman's discriminatory practices had been exposed by one of his own lieutenants, a black woman who had documented years of unequal treatment. As Jasmine reviewed Whitman's pre-sentence report, she was struck by the similarities to Officer Stevens's case. Both defendants had maintained their innocence despite overwhelming evidence. Both had shown little remorse for their actions, and both had been supported by law enforcement organizations that seemed more concerned with protecting their members than addressing discriminatory behavior. "Mr. Whitman," Jasmine said as the defendant stood for sentencing, "your actions as police chief created a hostile work environment for black officers and undermined public trust in law enforcement. Your behavior reflected a pattern of discrimination that damaged both your department and the community it served." Whitman's attorney had requested probation, arguing that his client had already suffered enough through the loss of his job and pension. But the evidence had revealed systematic discrimination that had affected dozens of officers over many years, warranting significant punishment. "I sentence you to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release," Jasmine announced. "You will also complete 300 hours of community service with organizations dedicated to police reform and civil rights education." The sentence was similar to what Stevens had received, establishing a pattern of accountability for law enforcement officials who violated civil rights. Legal observers noted that judges across the country were becoming more willing to impose significant sentences in discrimination cases, partly due to the precedent established by Jasmine's case. After the sentencing hearing, Jasmine returned to her chambers to find a surprise visitor waiting. Her mother, Gloria, who had driven down from Chicago to attend that evening's speech to the Women Judges Association. "Baby girl," Gloria said, embracing her daughter warmly. "I wanted to be here tonight when you received the Justice Award. I'm so proud of what you've accomplished." The Justice Award from the National Association of Women Judges was one of the highest honors in the legal profession, recognizing attorneys and judges who had made significant contributions to advancing equal justice. Previous recipients had included Supreme Court justices, pioneering civil rights lawyers, and distinguished legal scholars. "I never imagined that incident with Officer Stevens would lead to this," Jasmine said, settling into conversation with her mother while Claire tactfully excused herself to prepare for the afternoon hearings. "Maybe not," Gloria replied, "but I always knew you were meant to do something important with your life. That man trying to humiliate you just gave you the platform to make the changes you were already fighting for." The afternoon brought a different kind of case, the arraignment of 3 defendants charged with a hate crime conspiracy. The case was significant because it involved the first federal prosecution under enhanced hate crime statutes that had been strengthened partly in response to the national conversation about discrimination that Jasmine's case had helped launch. As she read the charges against the defendants, who had targeted black professionals in their community with harassment and threats, Jasmine reflected on how the legal landscape had evolved over the past 3 years. Hate crimes were being prosecuted more aggressively, civil rights violations were being taken more seriously, and institutions were being held accountable for discriminatory practices in ways that had been rare just a few years earlier. The evening's award ceremony was held at the Detroit Institute of Arts, with over 500 legal professionals in attendance. Jasmine's introduction was delivered by Chief Justice Patricia Collins, who had become a mentor and supporter throughout the years since the elevator incident. Judge Coleman could have chosen to quietly accept an apology and move on with her career, Collins told the audience. Instead, she chose to demand accountability and fight for changes that have benefited countless others. Her courage in standing up to discrimination has made our entire profession better. As Jasmine approached the podium to accept the award, she thought about Officer Stevens, who had been released from prison the previous year and had reportedly found work as a private security guard in rural Michigan. His life had been permanently changed by his discriminatory actions, serving as a reminder that discrimination carried real consequences. When I was denied access to that elevator 3 years ago, Jasmine began her acceptance speech, I had a choice. I could accept the humiliation and move on, or I could demand accountability and fight for change. I chose accountability, not just for myself, but for every person who has faced discrimination in our justice system. The audience listened intently as she continued. The reforms we've achieved, the training programs, the oversight offices, the accountability measures, they're not the end of our work. They're the beginning. Real change requires constant vigilance and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about how our institutions operate. She paused, looking out at the audience of judges, attorneys, and law students who represented the future of American jurisprudence. Every person in this room has the power to advance equal justice. When you see discrimination, call it out. When you witness unfairness, address it. When you have the opportunity to make our system more equitable, take it. Justice is not a spectator sport. It requires all of us to participate actively in creating the fair and equal society we claim to value. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 5 minutes, with many in the audience visibly moved by her words. During the reception afterward, Jasmine was approached by dozens of young lawyers and law students who thanked her for her courage and asked for advice on how they could contribute to the fight for equal justice. One conversation stood out among the rest. A young black woman who had just graduated from law school and was clerking for a federal judge approached nervously. "Judge Coleman," she said, "I wanted to thank you personally. Because of the changes you fought for, I've never faced the kind of discrimination in courthouses that my older colleagues describe. You made my career possible." The comment reminded Jasmine of why her painful experience had been worthwhile. The young lawyer would never know what it felt like to have her credentials questioned simply because of her race. She would work in courthouses where discrimination was actively discouraged rather than quietly tolerated. She would build her career in a legal system that was more accountable and more equitable than the one Jasmine had entered. As the evening wound down, Jasmine reflected on the journey from that humiliating Tuesday morning to this moment of recognition and celebration. She had never wanted to become a civil rights icon, but she had accepted the responsibility that came with her platform and had used it to create meaningful change. The fight was far from over. Discrimination still existed in courthouses, law firms, and legal institutions across the country, but the conversation had changed, the expectations had been raised, and the consequences for discriminatory behavior had become real and meaningful. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Attorney Henderson. "Watched your speech online. Riverside prosecutor wants to move forward with federal civil rights complaint. The network is mobilizing to support her case." The message reminded Jasmine that her work was ongoing. Each new case of discrimination required the same commitment to accountability and systemic change that had characterized her own experience. The network of advocates she had helped create would continue fighting these battles, ensuring that others wouldn't have to face discrimination alone. As her car pulled up to take her home, Jasmine looked back at the institute where she had just been honored for her contributions to equal justice. The building's neoclassical columns and imposing facade reminded her of the courthouse where her journey had begun 3 years earlier. She had entered that courthouse as an anonymous federal judge, seeking to do her job with dignity and respect. She was leaving this ceremony as a recognized leader in the fight for civil rights and equal justice. The transformation had been neither sought nor welcomed, but it had provided her with opportunities to create lasting change that would benefit generations of legal professionals who would follow in her path. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases of discrimination to address, and new opportunities to advance the cause of equal justice. But tonight, Judge Jasmine Coleman allowed herself to feel proud of what had been accomplished and optimistic about what still lay ahead in America's ongoing struggle to fulfill its promise of justice for all. The elevator incident that had humiliated her 3 years earlier had become the catalyst for reforms that were protecting countless others from similar treatment. Officer Stevens's moment of discrimination had backfired spectacularly, creating accountability and change that would outlast both his career and his consequences. As her car navigated the quiet Detroit streets toward home, Jasmine smiled at the irony. Stevens had blocked her access to an elevator because he couldn't believe someone who looked like her belonged in a position of federal authority. Now, largely because of his discriminatory actions, she had become one of the most influential voices in American law, with a platform that reached far beyond any single courthouse or courtroom. Justice, she reflected, had a way of prevailing over prejudice, even when the path was longer and more painful than anyone would choose. The fight continued, but progress was real, measurable, and lasting, and that made everything worthwhile.